Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe dignity can live even in the coldest rooms, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Grace Carter. He thought she was just a maid, but he was about to discover that sometimes the quietest person in the room hears what the powerful cannot. The grand hall of the Romano estate had never felt so silent. 20 professionals stood beneath the golden chandeliers, surrounded by marble columns, velvet curtains, and men in black suits who did not smile. Some of the professionals had flown in from New York, others from Rome. One had come from Milan with a leather case full of silver instruments and the confidence of a man who charged more per hour than Grace Carter made in a week. And still, none of them could fix it. At the center of the hall stood a black grand piano, polished so perfectly it reflected the chandelier lights like stars trapped under glass. It was not just an instrument. Everyone in the room knew that. They had been told before touching it. This piano had belonged to Lorenzo Romano's mother. The late Isabella Romano had brought it from Sicily decades ago, back when Lorenzo was only a boy with scraped knees and too much anger in his chest. Every night, she would sit at that piano and play until the boy stopped clenching his fists. Her music had been the only thing in the Romano house that did not sound like orders, threats, or fear. Now she was gone, and for 15 years, Lorenzo Romano had not allowed anyone to play it. Until tonight. Tonight was the anniversary of her death. Lorenzo stood near the staircase in a charcoal suit, his face carved from stone, his hands folded in front of him. The men around him knew better than to speak unless spoken to. When the most feared Italian Mafia boss in Chicago was quiet, even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The final expert, an older man with silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, pressed a key. The sound came out wrong. Thin, broken, almost painful. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. The expert swallowed. Mr. Romano, I'm sorry. The internal mechanism is too delicate. We've checked the hammers, the strings, the dampers, the pins. There is nothing more we can do tonight. Another professional added carefully. It may need to be taken apart completely, transported to a specialist workshop. No, Lorenzo said. One word. The room froze. The piano stayed in this house. That had never been negotiable. In the far corner, holding a silver tray and a folded cleaning cloth, Grace Carter stood as still as a shadow. Her black uniform was simple. Her shoes were worn at the edges. Her hair was pulled back neatly, the way the head housekeeper required. She had been trained to disappear in rooms like this. Do not interrupt, do not stared. Do not let rich men remember your name unless something has gone wrong. But Grace had heard it from the first note, not the failure everyone else heard. The cause. A small, trapped vibration beneath the left side of the soundboard. A soft metallic choke, almost hidden under the ugly tone. The kind of flaw most people would miss because they were too busy proving how much they knew. Grace's fingers tightened around the cloth. She should stay quiet. Quiet kept her employed. Quiet paid her rent. Quiet sent money to her aunt in Baton Rouge. Quiet was safe. But then Lorenzo stepped closer to the piano and placed one hand on its glossy black lid. For the first time that evening, Grace saw something no one else seemed to notice. Not rage. Grief. The most dangerous man in the city was standing in front of a broken memory, and all the experts in the world could not give it back to him. Grace took one breath, then another, and before fear could swallow her courage, she spoke. Sir. Every head turned. The silver-haired expert frowned as if the furniture had spoken. Grace lowered the tray slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. May I take a look? For one long second, nobody moved. Then someone laughed. Not loudly, just enough to cut. A maid. The Milan expert said, glancing at the others. 20 trained professionals have examined this instrument, and she wants to take a look. A few men smirked. One of Lorenzo's guards looked down. Grace felt heat rise in her face, but she did not step back. Lorenzo slowly turned toward her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and sharp enough to make stronger men forget their words. You know what this piano is worth? He asked. Grace held the cleaning cloth against her chest. No, sir, she said softly. But I know what it sounds like when something inside is begging to be heard. The laughter died. The room went silent. Lorenzo Romano did not answer immediately. He simply looked at Grace Carter, as if seeing her for the first time. For 3 months, she had moved through his house like a shadow, polishing the silver, folding linen, wiping dust from picture frames that cost more than the apartment she slept in. She had never asked questions, never lifted her voice, never lingered near his office doors when men in expensive suits spoke in low tones behind them. To Lorenzo, she had been another quiet employee in a mansion full of quiet employees. Useful, invisible, safe. But now she stood beneath the chandelier light, with 20 experts staring at her, asking to touch the one thing in the house no one touched without permission. The piano. His mother's piano. A long silence stretched across the marble floor. The silver-haired expert cleared his throat. Mr. Romano, with respect, allowing untrained hands near this instrument would be extremely unwise. Grace lowered her gaze for half a second. Untrained hands. She looked at her own fingers, dark and tired, the nails cut short, the knuckles rough from hot water, bleach, and years of work no one ever admired. These were the same hands that scrubbed wine stains from silk tablecloths. The same hands that carried grocery bags through rain. The same hands that counted coins at midnight and folded them into envelopes for bills. But once, long ago, these hands had known music. She was 8 years old the first time her father placed a tuning hammer in her palm. Don't force the sound, he had told her, sitting beside her in the back room of a small church in New Orleans. Listen first. Every instrument tells you where it hurts. Her father, Samuel Carter, had never owned a shop with his name painted on the glass. He never wore a suit. He never spoke at conferences or charged wealthy families thousands of dollars. But every church, school, and broken-down jazz bar in their neighborhood knew him. When a piano sounded wrong, they called Samuel. And Samuel brought grace. She remembered the smell of old wood, candle wax, rain on church steps. She remembered sitting under pianos while her father played single notes above her, asking, "Hear that?" Not the note, the thing behind the note. At first, she heard nothing. Then one day she did. A buzz beneath the bass strings. A loose screw near the pedal rod. A cracked felt damper pretending to be something worse. Her father had smiled like she had just discovered a secret language. That's it, baby girl. The world talks soft to people willing to listen. Grace had loved that world. She had loved it so much she earned a scholarship to study music restoration. For a short time, she had believed her life might become something beautiful. Then her mother got sick. The bills came first in thin white envelopes, then thick yellow ones, then angry red notices with final warnings printed in bold. Grace left school for one semester. Then another. She cleaned offices at night, hotel rooms in the morning, private homes on weekends. By the time her mother passed, the scholarship was gone, her father's tools had been sold, and music had become a door she no longer had the strength to open. So she became practical. She became quiet. She became the kind of woman rich people trusted because they never imagined she had once known anything worth respecting. But standing in Lorenzo Romano's hall, listening to that wounded piano, Grace felt the old language rise inside her again. The expert was still speaking. This piano likely requires a full disassembly, he insisted. The soundboard may be compromised. The action is unstable. The internal frame, no, Grace said. The word was soft, but it cut through the room. The expert blinked. Excuse me. Grace swallowed. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her wrists. The soundboard isn't compromised, she said. The frame isn't the problem either. A few of the professionals exchanged amused looks. One of them smiled with open pity. And you know this how? Grace turned toward the piano. Because the note is dying after impact. Not before. Something is catching the vibration after the hammer strikes. The smile faded slightly. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. Not with anger this time. With interest. Grace stepped one pace closer, then stopped. She would not touch it without permission. The left sustain is choking the lower register, she continued. It sounds like damage because the resonance is being trapped. But it isn't dead. Her voice grew steadier now. It's blocked. The room changed. Not completely, but enough. The laughter did not return. The silver-haired expert adjusted his glasses, suddenly less certain than before. Lorenzo looked from Grace to the piano, then back to Grace. For years, men had stood before him making promises, excuses, threats, and lies. He had learned to hear fear in a voice. Greed, pride, deception. But Grace Carter did not sound like any of them. She sounded like someone telling the truth, even though the truth might cost her everything. Lorenzo stepped away from the piano. Then, with one slow movement, he raised his hand. Let her look. A murmur passed through the professionals. The expert from Milan stiffened. Mr. Romano, I strongly advise against. Lorenzo did not even turn his head. I said, he murmured, let her look. That was enough. The men stepped back. Grace set the silver tray on a side table. The small sound it made against the wood seemed too loud in the silence. She walked toward the piano carefully, each step carrying every year she had spent hiding what she knew. When she reached the bench, she did not sit. She placed one hand just above the keys, not touching them yet. For a brief moment, her reflection appeared in the piano's black surface, a maid in a plain uniform, standing where experts had failed. Behind her, Lorenzo Romano watched without blinking. Grace pressed one key. The broken note trembled through the room. Then she pressed another, and another. Her eyes closed. There it was. Small, metallic, trapped beneath the beauty. Grace opened her eyes. I found it, she whispered. The room held its breath. Top of form Grace Carter's whisper seemed to hang in the air longer than the broken note itself. I found it. No one moved. The 20 professionals stood in a half circle behind her, their expensive shoes planted on Lorenzo Romano's marble floor, their polished cases open beside them like proof of importance. They had brought tools from Italy, Germany, New York. They had brought certificates, reputations, accents sharpened by confidence. Grace had brought nothing but her ears. The silver-haired expert gave a small laugh, but it came out weaker than before. You found it, he repeated. Just like that. Grace did not look at him. Her eyes remained on the piano. There's a sympathetic buzz under the bass bridge, she said softly. But the buzz isn't the real problem. It's hiding the choke. One of the younger technicians frowned despite himself. That doesn't make sense. It does, Grace said. If someone adjusted the pedal assembly too tightly after moving it. The room shifted. A few faces turned toward the maintenance crew near the doorway. Lorenzo noticed. He noticed everything. 2 weeks earlier, the piano had been moved 6 inches away from the window after a storm cracked part of the glass ceiling above the West Hall. It had taken 6 men, a hydraulic lift, and a supervisor who promised him the instrument would not be harmed. Lorenzo's voice lowered. Are you saying someone damaged it? Grace finally turned her head. No, sir, she said. I'm saying someone tried not to damage it and tightened something they didn't understand. That answer saved a man's job without protecting his mistake. Lorenzo heard it. The experts heard it too. The silver-haired man stepped forward, cheeks coloring. Mr. Romano, this is becoming absurd. With all due respect, she is guessing. A domestic worker should not be diagnosing a European concert grand. Grace's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Domestic worker. He said it the way people said stain. Or burden. Or thing in the way. She had heard that tone before. In hotel hallways when guests left wet towels on the floor and called her girl. In elevators when women clutched handbags closer to their bodies to in music shops where men spoke over her head while she knew more than they did in the hospital billing office where a clerk looked at her payment plan and asked if she understood numbers. Grace had spent years swallowing replies because rent was due, medicine was expensive, and pride did not keep the lights on. But tonight, with Lorenzo Romano's mother's piano trembling beneath her hand, something inside her refused to shrink. She looked at the expert. I'm not guessing. A small silence followed. The expert's mouth tightened. Then prove it. The words landed like a challenge. Several of Lorenzo's men looked to their boss, expecting anger, maybe a command to remove the man from the hall. But Lorenzo did nothing. He only watched Grace. Not because he doubted her. Because he wanted to see whether she doubted herself. Grace took a slow breath. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small cotton glove she used for polishing antique frames. She slipped it over her right hand, then knelt beside the piano. The marble was cold beneath her knees. Someone behind her muttered, "Careful." Grace almost smiled. Careful was all she had ever been. She pressed the sustained pedal lightly with one hand and tapped the lower wooden support with the other. Once, twice. Then she leaned close, listening not to the loud sound, but to the tiny answer beneath it. There. A faint rattle. Hidden. Ashamed. Her father's voice returned to her as clearly as if he were kneeling beside her. Don't bully the instrument, baby girl. Ask it where it hurts. Grace shifted her fingers under the pedal rod and touched a narrow brass bracket near the lower frame. It was slightly twisted, almost impossible to see unless you already knew where pain liked to hide. She looked up. This bracket is pinching the pedal return. That's why the lower dampers aren't releasing cleanly. The strings are speaking, but the mechanism is holding their throat. The younger technician's expression changed. He heard it now. So did two others. The silver-haired expert stepped closer, then stopped, pride wrestling with truth across his face. Grace stood and faced Lorenzo. "I can fix it," she said. Lorenzo's eyes stayed on hers. "How long?" Grace glanced at the piano. 1 minute. Someone scoffed. 1 minute, the expert snapped. "This is not a kitchen drawer." Grace turned back to him, calm now. "No," she said. "It's not." Then she looked at Lorenzo. "It belonged to someone who loved you." The air left the room. Lorenzo's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A door closing. Or opening. It was impossible to tell. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Not his men. Not his lawyers. Not the priests who avoided his name in public, but accepted his donations in private. Grace Carter, the maid with worn shoes and tired hands, had done what 20 professionals had not. She had understood the piano was not expensive. It was sacred. Lorenzo stepped closer. His shadow fell across the black lid. "You have 1 minute," he said. Grace nodded. The expert stepped back. The guard stopped breathing. And beneath the chandelier light, Grace Carter knelt beside the piano like a woman returning to a language the world had tried to steal from her. Grace Carter lowered herself beside the piano, and the entire hall seemed to lean toward her. The chandelier light trembled across the black lacquer. 20 professionals watched with folded arms and tightened mouths. A few of them still looked offended, as if her confidence had insulted their education. Others looked curious despite themselves. Lorenzo Romano said nothing. He only glanced at the gold watch on his wrist. 1 minute. Grace heard the silent countdown before it began. She placed her left hand on the sustain pedal and pressed it down halfway. Not fully, just enough to feel the resistance. Then she reached beneath the lower frame with her gloved hand, moving slowly through the narrow space where polished wood became shadow. The first thing she felt was dust. The second was cold brass. The third was the problem. A small bracket had been forced too far inward, squeezing the pedal return rod against a felt cushion that had slipped out of position. It was tiny, almost ridiculous. The kind of mistake that did not look serious enough to ruin anything. But Grace knew better. Small pressure, held long enough, could silence the most beautiful things. She paused. For a second, she was not in the Romano estate anymore. She was 12 years old again, kneeling beside her father in the back of a Baptist church after Sunday service. Rain tapped against stained glass windows. Her father's sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hands dark with oil and dust. "Most people look for broken things," Samuel Carter had told her. "But sometimes, baby girl, nothing is broken. Something is just being held wrong." Grace blinked the memory away. Behind her, the silver-haired expert muttered, "This is a waste of time." Lorenzo's eyes moved toward him. The man immediately went quiet. Grace did not react. She had learned long ago that not every insult deserved the dignity of an answer. She slipped 2 fingers under the bracket and tested the tension. Too tight. If she forced it, she could bend the rod and make everything worse. If she hesitated, the minute would run out, and the room would decide she had been foolish for speaking. Her heartbeat slowed. 1 breath, then another. She lifted the felt cushion with her thumb, eased the brass bracket outward by the smallest fraction, and gently guided the rod back into its natural line. A soft metallic click echoed beneath the piano. It was barely louder than a whisper, but Grace heard it like thunder. One of the younger technicians leaned forward. Grace pressed the pedal again. This time, it moved cleanly. No scrape. No choke. No trapped vibration. She rose to her feet, smoothing the front of her black uniform as if she had only finished dusting a shelf. The room waited. Grace stepped away from the piano and looked at Lorenzo. "Try it now, sir." The silver-haired expert scoffed under his breath, but nobody joined him. Lorenzo did not move at first. He stared at Grace, then at the piano, as though something impossible had been placed before him and he did not yet trust the world enough to touch it. Finally, he turned to the pianist waiting near the bench. "Play." The pianist swallowed. His hands hovered over the keys. For 15 years, no one had played Isabella Romano's song in that hall. For 15 years, the instrument had been polished, protected, guarded, but never truly heard. Now the pianist pressed the first note. The sound rose into the air. Warm, clear, alive. Not perfect in the way machines are perfect. Perfect in the way memory is perfect, trembling, human, full of something that had survived silence. The second note followed. Then the third. A melody began to unfold beneath the chandeliers, soft and aching, filling the marble hall with a tenderness no one had expected to survive in a house built on fear. Lorenzo Romano froze. His hand, still resting near his watch, stopped mid-motion. The color drained from his face. For one brief moment, the most dangerous man in Chicago was no longer dangerous at all. He was a boy again. A boy standing barefoot in a kitchen in Sicily, listening to his mother play while the world outside shouted, threatened, and burned. Grace saw his jaw tighten. Then she saw his eyes shine. No one dared speak. The room went silent around the music. The melody moved through the hall like a ghost returning home. No one in that room understood the song except Lorenzo Romano. To the professionals, it was only music, old, slow, Sicilian, played in a minor key that carried sadness without begging for pity. To the guards, it was something unfamiliar, something too gentle for a house where most sounds were footsteps, locked doors, and orders spoken under breath. But to Lorenzo, every note had a face. His mother's face. Isabella Romano, standing barefoot on the kitchen tiles with flour on her hands. Isabella humming while stirring sauce in a dented copper pot. Isabella touching his cheek after his father shouted too loudly. Isabella sitting at that piano late at night, playing not because the house was peaceful, but because it was not. The pianist continued. Lorenzo did not blink. Grace stood a few steps away, hands folded in front of her, still as stone. She knew better than to look directly at a powerful man's grief. Grief was private. Grief was dangerous. Grief made people either softer or crueler, and in a house like this, you never knew which one would happen first. But she could hear his breathing change. Slow at first, then uneven. The room seemed to notice too. The silver-haired expert lowered his eyes. The younger technicians stopped shifting their weight. Even the guards near the door stood differently now, as though they had accidentally walked into a church. Lorenzo took one step toward the piano, then another. The pianist's fingers trembled, but he did not stop. The final phrase rose beneath the chandelier light, soft as a hand placed on a child's head. It lingered there, floating over marble and velvet and men who had forgotten how to be tender. Then the last note faded. No one applauded. No one dared. The silence afterward felt larger than the music. Lorenzo stood with his hand on the piano's black lid. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface. Older now, harder, dressed in power and shadow. But beneath it, for one brief second, he could almost see the boy his mother had tried to save. His voice, when it came, was low. Play it again. The pianist looked uncertain. Sir. Lorenzo did not turn. Again. The song began once more. This time, Lorenzo closed his eyes. Grace watched his shoulders drop by the smallest amount. It was almost nothing. Anyone else would have missed it. But Grace had spent her life noticing small things. The shift in a room before someone yelled, the tightening of a hand before a glass broke, the tiny wrong sound inside a wounded instrument. She noticed, and she understood. The most feared man in the city had not wanted the piano fixed because it was expensive. He had wanted proof that something from before the blood, before the power, before the empire, was still alive. When the song ended the second time, Lorenzo opened his eyes. He turned slowly toward Grace. The entire room followed his gaze. For a moment, she felt every stare land on her uniform, her worn shoes, her dark hands, the cleaning cloth still tucked into her apron pocket. The old fear rose again, familiar and bitter. Had she overstepped? Had she touched too much? Had she reminded him of something he wanted buried? Lorenzo walked toward her. Each step echoed across the marble. Grace held herself still. When he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. Not weakness. Not softness exactly. Something heavier. Memory. He looked down at her hands. Then back at her face. Who taught you to listen like that? He asked. Grace swallowed. My father, sir. What was his name? Samuel Carter. Lorenzo repeated it quietly, as though the name deserved space in the room. Samuel Carter. Grace felt her throat tighten. No one in years had said her father's name like it mattered. He fixed church pianos, she said. School pianos. Bar pianos. Anything people couldn't afford to replace. Lorenzo studied her. And you learned from him? Grace nodded. He used to say instruments don't lie. People do, but instruments don't. They tell you exactly where they hurt, if you're patient enough to listen. A strange expression crossed Lorenzo's face. Behind him, the 20 professionals stood in silence. The same men who had laughed at her. The same men who had watched her kneel on marble like she belonged beneath them. Lorenzo turned his head slightly. His voice sharpened. You heard that? No one answered. He looked directly at the silver-haired expert. I said, did you hear her? The man's face paled. Yes, Mr. Romano. Lorenzo's eyes hardened. Good. Because tonight, she listened better than all of you. Grace lowered her gaze, not from shame this time, but because the room had become too bright. And for the first time since she entered that mansion, silence did not feel like fear. It felt like respect. Lorenzo Romano did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In that house, anger shouted only when it belonged to weak men. Lorenzo's anger arrived quietly, dressed in silk, standing still beneath chandelier light, while every guilty person in the room felt the temperature drop. The silver-haired expert shifted his weight. His gold-rimmed glasses caught the light. A few minutes earlier, he had looked at Grace Carter as if she were dust on the edge of his sleeve. Now he looked anywhere except her face. Lorenzo noticed that too. You laughed, Lorenzo said. The expert's throat moved. Mr. Romano, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. No, Lorenzo replied. There was no misunderstanding. The room became painfully still. Grace stood near the piano with her hands folded, wishing suddenly that everyone would stop looking at her. She had not spoken to embarrass anyone. She had only wanted to help. That was the strange cruelty of rooms like this. When the ignored person finally proved useful, the room acted as if her dignity had become an emergency. Lorenzo turned fully toward the expert. You heard a woman ask to help, he said. And before she touched a single key, you decided what she was capable of. The expert's face reddened. With respect, sir, we were protecting the instrument. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. No, you were protecting your pride. No one breathed. A young technician near the back lowered his head. Lorenzo looked at the others one by one. 20 of you stood around my mother's piano with tools, titles, and expensive words. You spoke of soundboards, frames, and full disassembly. You wanted to remove it from my home. His hand rested on the piano lid. She listened for less than 1 minute. Grace felt the words land against her chest. Not like praise, like weight. Because recognition, when it comes after years of being unseen, can hurt almost as much as humiliation. It touches places you trained yourself to protect. The silver-haired expert forced a thin smile. She was fortunate. Lorenzo's face went completely still. That was when the younger technician stepped forward. No, he said quietly. Every head turned. The young man looked terrified, but he kept going. She wasn't fortunate. She was right. The bracket was pinching the return. I should have checked it. He looked at Grace. I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Grace blinked. Miss Carter. Not girl. Not maid. Not her. Miss Carter. The apology moved through the room like the first crack in ice. Another technician cleared his throat. I'm sorry as well. Then another. I apologize, Miss Carter. I shouldn't have laughed. You were correct. The words came awkwardly, some sincere, some dragged out by fear of Lorenzo's stare. But one by one they came. Grace did not smile. She simply nodded. A small nod. Enough to accept without pretending it had not hurt. The silver-haired expert remained silent. Lorenzo turned back to him. And you? The man's pride fought for one final second. Then it lost. He faced Grace, his mouth tight. I apologize. Miss Carter. Grace held his gaze. Her father had once told her that apologies were like tuning. Some people only adjusted when pressure forced them. But even forced correction could stop damage from spreading. Thank you, she said. 2 words. Nothing more. That quiet answer unsettled the room more than anger would have. Lorenzo looked toward his head of staff, Mrs. Bellini, who had been watching from near the archway with one hand pressed to her chest. Make sure Miss Carter is paid for tonight as a restoration consultant, he said. Grace turned sharply. Sir, that isn't necessary. Lorenzo looked at her. It is. The finality in his voice closed the matter. Mrs. Bellini nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Romano. Lorenzo's gaze returned to the experts. As for the rest of you, your invoices will be reviewed. Several faces went pale. The silver-haired expert opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Lorenzo stepped closer to the piano and touched the edge of the lid with surprising gentleness. My mother used to say education makes a man useful, he said. Humility makes him worth listening to. He turned back to Grace. For the first time that night, he bowed his head slightly. Not much, but enough. A mafia boss, in front of his men, giving respect to a woman they had treated like furniture. Grace's eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. The chandelier light softened across the marble. The piano stood silent now, but different. So did the room. And somewhere in that silence, Grace Carter felt something return to her that no paycheck had ever been able to buy. Her name. The experts left the Romano estate without their usual confidence. Their leather cases clicked shut one by one. Their polished shoes moved across the marble floor more quietly than when they had entered. No one laughed now. No one whispered about the maid with dirty hands. They walked past Grace Carter as if passing a person they should have noticed from the beginning. Some nodded. Some could not meet her eyes. The silver-haired expert was the last to leave. At the doorway, he paused, glanced back at the piano, then at Grace. For a moment, it looked as if he wanted to say something more. But pride still sat heavy on his tongue. So he only lowered his head and disappeared into the night. The front doors closed. The sound echoed through the mansion like the end of a trial. Only Lorenzo, Grace, Mrs. Bellini, and 2 guards remained in the grand hall. The piano stood beneath the chandelier, black and shining, no longer looking like a dead object displayed for memory. It looked awake now, as if one small correction had allowed the whole room to breathe again. Grace reached for the silver tray she had set down earlier. Habit. The old reflex returned before she could stop it. Clean the table. Fold the cloth. Become useful in the way people expected. But before her fingers touched the tray, Lorenzo spoke. Leave it. Grace froze. Sir, you are not here to clean tonight. The words were simple, but they struck something deep inside her. Not here to clean. For years, every room had told her the opposite. Kitchens, hotel corridors, office bathrooms, private mansions. Each one had taught her that her worth was measured by how quietly she could erase other people's mess. Grace slowly pulled her hand back. Mrs. Bellini watched with soft eyes, but said nothing. Lorenzo walked to the piano bench and sat down, though he did not play. His large hands rested on his knees. Hands that had signed dangerous deals, commanded fearful men, built an empire out of silence and loyalty. Now those hands looked strangely uncertain. My mother hated this room, he said. Grace did not know whether she was allowed to answer, so she stayed quiet. Lorenzo looked at the chandelier above them. My father built it to impress people. Marble from Italy, gold from old estates, paintings no one understood, but everyone pretended to admire. His mouth tightened. My mother said the room had too much echo and not enough soul. Grace's eyes moved to the piano. She brought the soul, she said softly. Lorenzo turned toward her. The words had slipped out before she could hide them. For a second, fear rose in her chest. But Lorenzo did not look offended. He looked wounded by the accuracy. Yes, he said. She did. Silence settled again, but this time it was not sharp. It was heavy, almost human. Lorenzo's gaze dropped to the piano keys. I was 12 when she first played that song for me. My father had just humiliated one of the kitchen workers in front of everyone. I laughed because the men around him laughed. His jaw flexed. My mother waited until they were gone. Then she sat here and played. Grace listened. She told me, Lorenzo, a man who needs someone smaller to feel tall is not powerful. He is afraid. The words moved through Grace like a slow bell. Lorenzo looked up. I forgot that for a long time. Grace thought of the expert's laugh. The way the room had accepted it so easily. The way she herself had almost accepted it too, because pain becomes familiar when it has visited often enough. You remembered tonight, she said. Lorenzo studied her, and for once, his stare did not feel like a threat. No, he said. You reminded me. Grace looked down. Praise still felt dangerous. Compliments from powerful people often came with hooks hidden inside them. She had learned to be careful with kindness when it came from people who could change her life with one sentence. Lorenzo seemed to understand her hesitation. He stood. Mrs. Bellini. Yes, sir. Prepare a new contract for Miss Carter by morning. Grace's head lifted. Lorenzo continued. Not housekeeping. Restoration consultant. Private salary. Full benefits. Flexible hours if she chooses to study again. Grace's breath caught. Study again. The words found a buried place in her chest and pressed against it. Mr. Romano, I can't. You can, he said quietly. The question is whether you want to. Grace's hands trembled once before she clasped them together. For years, wanting had felt selfish. Wanting music, wanting school, wanting a life that did not leave her body aching at midnight. She had trained herself to survive on need because dreams were too expensive. Now a door stood open in front of her, and she was terrified to walk through it. Lorenzo stepped away from the piano. This house has paid many men for noise, he said. Tonight, it will pay someone who knows how to listen. Grace looked at the instrument, then at the man who had finally seen her. The room did not feel smaller anymore. For the first time, it felt like it had made space. Grace Carter did not sleep that night. Long after the Romano mansion had gone quiet, long after the guards changed shifts and the chandeliers dimmed to a soft golden glow, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at her hands. Restoration consultant. Full benefits. Flexible hours if she chose to study again. The words should have made her happy. Instead, they frightened her. Hope had always been more dangerous than exhaustion. Exhaustion was familiar. Exhaustion had a schedule. You woke before sunrise, worked until your back ached, swallowed whatever pain you could not afford to treat, and told yourself tomorrow would be the same because sameness meant survival. Hope asked questions. What if life could be different? What if the years you buried were not dead? What if the gift you silenced was still waiting for you? Grace rubbed her thumb across the rough skin of her palm. She thought of her father's old tuning kit, the one she had sold after the funeral to pay part of the rent. She still remembered the man at the pawn shop turning each tool over with bored fingers, offering her less than half its worth. She had wanted to scream. Instead, she had nodded. That was what poverty did. It did not always steal loudly. Sometimes it made you agree to losing pieces of yourself because there was no other way to keep breathing. A soft knock came at her door. Grace stood quickly. Yes. Mrs. Bellini stepped inside, carrying a small envelope and a folded document. The head housekeeper had always been kind in quiet ways. Extra soup left near the stove. A warning whispered before difficult guests arrived. A fresh pair of gloves placed in Grace's locker without explanation. Tonight, her eyes looked wet. Mr. Romano asked me to give you this, she said. Grace took the envelope first. Inside was her payment for the evening. Not housekeeping wages. Consultant pay. Her breath caught at the amount. Mrs. Bellini, this is too much. No, the older woman said gently. It is what they would have paid any man who walked in here with a leather case and a proud mouth. Grace looked down. The sentence settled between them. Then Mrs. Bellini handed her the document. The new contract will be finalized in the morning. This is the draft. He wanted you to read it before anyone asks you to sign. Grace blinked. Read it first. No one had ever said that to her about employment paperwork. Usually, she was pointed toward the bottom line and told where to write her name. She unfolded the paper carefully. Her eyes moved across the terms. Private restoration consultant, salary increase, health coverage, paid training, education allowance. Then she stopped. One line made her throat close. Access to the West Hall piano for personal practice after working hours. Grace covered her mouth with one hand. Mrs. Bellini's voice softened. He asked me what your father's name was again. Grace looked up. Why? He said a man who taught someone to listen like that deserved not to be forgotten. For a moment, Grace could not speak. All those years, she had carried Samuel Carter's name alone. In crowded buses. In hospital waiting rooms. In rooms where people saw her uniform before her face. She had carried him quietly, afraid that if she spoke too much about what she had lost, the grief would swallow her whole. Now, in the most unlikely house in Chicago, someone had made space for his memory. Grace sat back down slowly. Mrs. Bellini placed a hand on her shoulder. You earned this. Grace shook her head, tears finally slipping free. I almost didn't speak. The older woman nodded as if she understood too well. Most women like us almost don't. That sentence broke something open. Grace cried then, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the tired grief of someone who had been strong for too long. She cried for the scholarship letter folded away in an old box. For her father's tools. For every room where she had known the answer and swallowed it, because someone had already decided she could not possibly know. Mrs. Bellini did not rush her. She only stood beside her, steady and quiet. When the tears passed, Grace wiped her face and looked again at the contract. Down the hall, faintly, the piano waited in the dark, not as a master's possession, not as a rich man's memory, but as a door. For the first time in years, Grace Carter allowed herself to imagine walking through it. And somewhere beneath the silence, dignity began to sound like music. The next morning, sunlight entered the Romano estate differently. It spilled through the tall windows of the West Hall, touching the marble floor, the velvet curtains, the black piano waiting beneath the chandelier. The room no longer felt like a museum built for powerful men. It felt softer now, quieter, as if the music from the night before had stayed inside the walls. Grace Carter stood at the entrance with the new contract in her hands. She had read it 3 times, then a 4th, not because she doubted the words were there, but because part of her still expected them to disappear. Private restoration consultant, education allowance, access to the West Hall piano. Her name printed at the top. Grace Carter. Not maid, not temporary staff, not invisible. Her name. Mrs. Bellini stood beside her, holding a small wooden box. She offered it without speaking. Grace opened it slowly. Inside lay a set of tuning tools, polished and new, resting on dark blue velvet. A tuning hammer, felt wedges, mutes, small brass instruments that caught the morning light like tiny promises. Grace's breath caught. On top of them was a folded card. The handwriting was sharp, controlled, unmistakably Lorenzo's. For the daughter of Samuel Carter, some gifts should not stay buried. Grace pressed the card against her chest. For a moment, she could not move. Then footsteps sounded behind her. Lorenzo Romano entered the hall without his usual crowd of guards. No lawyers, no experts, no men waiting for orders. Just him, dressed in a black suit, his expression unreadable but no longer cold. Grace straightened immediately. Mr. Romano. He looked at the box in her hands. Do they suit you? Grace tried to answer, but her voice failed her. She nodded instead. Lorenzo accepted the silence. For once, he did not command it. He simply walked to the piano and rested one hand on its lid. My mother used to say a house reveals itself by how it treats people who cannot fight back. Grace looked at him. He did not meet her eyes at first. I thought power meant making every room obey me. He continued. Last night, I remembered something I should never have forgotten. The words settled between them. Grace understood then that this was not just about a piano. It had never been just about a piano. The broken sound had exposed the room. It had exposed the experts who laughed before listening, that IT had exposed the servants who had learned to stay quiet to survive, that IT had exposed Lorenzo himself, a man powerful enough to frighten a city, yet unable to hear the pain standing in his own home. He turned to her. I owe you an apology too. Grace froze. Sir, you should not have needed to prove your worth in front of 20 men to be treated with respect. Her eyes burned. The sentence was quiet, but it reached deeper than praise. Because praise said she was exceptional. But his apology admitted the room had been wrong before she ever touched the piano. Grace lowered her gaze, not to hide, but to gather herself. Thank you, she whispered. Lorenzo nodded once. Then he stepped back from the bench. Play something. Grace looked up. The old fear moved through her quickly, too quickly to stop. She saw herself at 8 years old beside her father, 17 with a scholarship letter in her hand, 23 at a pawn shop, selling the last pieces of her dream, 30 standing in a mansion where people had laughed because she dared to know something. Her fingers trembled. Then she set the wooden box down, walked to the bench, and sat. The keys waited beneath her hands. For years, she had cleaned this room. Now she filled it. The first note was soft. The second followed with more courage. Then the melody came, not Isabella Romano's song, not her father's church hymn, but something in between. A song made from grief and survival, from swallowed words and reopened doors. Mrs. Bellini covered her mouth. Lorenzo stood near the window, motionless. Outside, guards paused in the hallway. A cook stopped carrying a tray. One by one, people drifted toward the West Hall, drawn not by fear, but by sound. Grace did not look back. She played until the room changed. Until no one saw the uniform first. Until no one remembered the laughter before the apology. Until the marble hall, once built to impress the powerful, finally honored the quiet woman who had saved its soul. When the last note faded, nobody spoke. Then Lorenzo Romano bowed his head. The others followed. Not because he ordered them to. Because they understood. Grace Carter rested her hands on the keys, tears shining in her eyes, but not falling. And that day, the world remembered what dignity sounds like. Bottom of form.